Hi, I'm Stephen Reily, the founding director of Remuseum, and welcome to Remuseum Conversations. I'm excited to have our two panelists today, the two people joining me who joined me in a similar panel discussion and presentation we had at the AAMC, the Association of American Museum Curators Conference. We thank the AMC for that opportunity, and we were so excited about that panel discussion. We wanted to take our show on the road, and hence this format where we're going to present our thoughts and the work that we shared at that experience, at that conference, in a more informal setting. And the two people joining me bring a lot to this conversation. The first is Susan de Menil, who is a co-founder of the Art and Antiquities Blockchain Consortium and was the president and executive director of the Byzantine Fresco Chapel at the Menil Collection in Houston. We're also being joined by Shalini Gall, who's the Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs at the Portland Museum of Art in Portland, Maine, which she joined from a similar position and years she spent at the Colby College Museum of Art beforehand. Before I ask Susan and Shalini to start sharing their stories, I wanted to set a little bit of the framework that I came to this conversation with, because I had a thesis that changing models of ownership for museums over the last decades is also changing our modes of interpretation, how we make art meaningful and relevant to the public. And I started my way of thinking about this, and this is a very personal timeline that others will find gaps in and inaccuracies, but based around a series of changes in the way that museums have thought and had to deal with concepts of ownership, starting in the 1990s, when laws made museums take much more seriously claims regarding Nazi looting of art during the 1930s. And all of a sudden, museums found that defenses that they had used in the past, defenses like citing a statute of limitation or the chain of title or concepts like spoils of war, were no longer relevant, not only against moral claims from families whose art had been stolen violently by the Nazis, but also when international law changed and changed the framework quite quickly for museums to deal with that art, something they're continuing to deal with till today. Then next, in a certain kind of order, museums started confronting a whole new set of claims of art from what I would call the ancient worlds, in particular from Greece and Roman empires. And again, many of the defenses they used in past were no longer relevant. And museums are still, to this day, dealing with many, many claims of repatriation and finding new ways to acknowledge them, because in some cases, the art is shifted from the museum ownership to ownership by, say, the Italian state with a loan back to the museum. And then that begets a question of how does the museum talk to the public about it? Because we have to open our doors, not just to new ways of ownership, but to new ways of talking about art. That was followed and continues to be addressed by many museums with art from African nations. The Benin bronzes are kind of the most notable case of those, a large body of work that was ripped out of the hands of an African nation by English colonialists in the 19th century. There are documentary films made about this work, and many museums and countries are trying to address the way we either return that work or talk about it differently to the public if it is going to remain in public hands in the US in particular. And then finally, and even more recently, are a whole host of ways that museums are addressing concepts of ownership regarding indigenous art. Shalini is going to talk about that work. But, museums were grappling with this already. How do we honor our obligations to First Nations and the groups that made the work that museums have held for so long, whether displayed in their galleries or in their basements? And of course, the playing field for that work was changed dramatically with federal legislation, with NAGPRA, which actually requires museums to behave differently. Many museums could have been better prepared for this work, but NAGPRA is now making them address really kind of creatively interesting concepts of ownership that I think are calling us to talk about art in new ways, whether the work of art is contested or currently contested, I should say, or not. So that's the framework for this conversation. I'm going to ask Susan and Shalini to talk about some examples from their work that illustrate this idea and how they've been part of conversations, changing the way that concepts of ownership change the way we talk about art to the public, or I guess forces us to deliberately not change the way or choose not to change the way we talk about art to the public. And Susan, I want to start with yours because it's kind of the earliest of the examples we're going to talk about. And you got called into very interesting situation with some ancient frescoes from the Orthodox world.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here. So yes, the story I was involved in started before I was involved in it, which was in 1983, in relationship to some looted frescoes that were from the Byzantium period, from late 13th century, that had come from Cyprus, that were the spoils of the Turkish invasion and ripped out of a Byzantine chapel in the northern part of Cyprus. And to, I think, Stephen's point, in 1983, there was still sort of the specter of UNESCO in 1971, and what do you do, and how do these objects circulate? And so in this case, it was 38 pieces of a dome and an apse that had been in this small votive chapel, a Christ and a Mary depiction. And they had been cut up into 38 pieces in the hope of selling each piece into the gray market, through then to reputable dealers and into collectors or museums. And my late mother-in-law was offered the entirety of the 38 pieces by a very reputable dealer from London, who said to her they had been found in a excavation in Turkey, they were building an apartment building, and lo and behold, they dug the basement, and what was there but these frescoes. And so she was quite old at this point, had realized that these were both important works of art, and additionally, probably there was something funny about the story. So she went and hired Herbert Brownell, who was the former Attorney General under Eisenhower, then in private practice, who advised her, which was radical at the time, to advertise to the likely countries that these frescoes might have come from. 3 countries replied and said they were theirs. Cyprus was able to prove through in situ photographs that indeed they had come from there. So then she was faced with a very difficult problem of, what do you do? Do you save them? Do you buy them? You know they're stolen. What's the right thing to do? And ultimately, a very creative and I think forward-thinking event occurred, which was that she adopted the idea of stewardship, and essentially made a deal with the Church of Cyprus, who was the rightful owner, that said that she would restore them to a dome and an apse in return for a 20-year loan, essentially, agreement. But where the more interesting part was that while they were on loan in Houston, Texas, they were going to remain in title and in property name with the Church of Cyprus, which I think at that time really had not been done that early on. And she decided that the right thing to do, I think this is where the interpretation, if you will, in this story occurred in part, is she felt that to hang them in a museum would be sort of dishonoring the intention of the art. And so she decided to build a chapel, and put them back into a spiritual context in which they could be experienced in Houston. And the Archbishop of Cyprus came and consecrated this building, and it functioned both as a public venue and as a Greek Orthodox church during the time they stayed in Houston.
Right. So 20 years comes up pretty quickly.
Right. And so
Right.
suddenly what happened is the chapel got built. I somehow ended up the executive director of this project. And over the course of the time from 98 to 2012, which is when the agreement had to be revisited, I did all the programming, and it was a really remarkable experience. 500,000 people saw them, which was arguably more than had seen them since the 13th century. So then it was time for them to go back. They are currently in the Palace Museum of the Archbishop of Cyprus.
I think it's so interesting recognizing that the actual museum galleries would have been a complicated place to show that work for many reasons. The
Right.
nature of spirit work that has a spiritual component. I can't really think of a better lead in to ask Shalini. And I'm going to ask you to start kind of with the present, or not the more recent history, because you've been working, really intentionally with your colleagues and with members of First Nations from your surrounding area to sort of get this right with new acquisitions and see what does that mean in the 2020s, right? So tell us a little bit about stewardship and acquisitions there.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think one that does transition really quite beautifully from what Susan laid out, which was really, thinking deeply about questions of ownership and how you handle that when you know that there are shared interests involved moving forward, both for the care of works of art, but also for the way in which they're shared and those stories are told, right? And who is responsible and has an active role in that act of storytelling. So here at the Portland Museum of Art in Maine, our introduction to a lot of this work was with the project that started about 4 years ago, which was the reinstallation of our American art galleries. And like many museums across the country, that whole moment and that whole initiative made us really clearly aware of the absence of many voices from our indigenous communities here in the Northeast in the art of the Americas, right? So we really wanted to address that and really expand out what we were sharing with our audiences. So we started working very closely with members of, in Maine, the Wabanaki Confederacy, which refers to the 5 tribal nations, the Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, and Abenakis. And so those groups kind of collectively, and again, spread across today what is Maine and what is Canada, right? Because of course the national and state boundaries really did not respect the borders and the lands of tribal nations. Really challenged so many processes that were central to our museum. And so we embarked on this project of the reinstallation of the American Art Galleries. Again, a year and a half later, in 2023, we opened these newly installed American Art Galleries, and they do include now many more representations of works by many Wabanaki artists. And in that process, questions started to emerge about how we would be working with contemporary artists, how we would be thinking about notions of ownership and stewardship differently. And one of the ways that this became it really emerged organically from this process was, again, artists started challenging us in some of those conversations, saying, all right, we want to support you. We want to support you in the expanded storytelling that you're interested in doing. But we also want you to think differently about how you own our work and what happens to that work once you purchase it from us. And so, we really started relying on kind of these models of shared stewardship that are that have been developed across the field, as both you and Susan have described, but also the NAGPRA regulations, which really again made museums have to do this work quite differently, particularly for historical collections. So the challenge came to us of, okay, how do we get some of the values in some of those regulations and some of those policies and changes, and really embed them into new types of ownership and stewardship agreements when working directly with contemporary Indigenous artists, right? That was really the challenge that lay before us. And it was a really extended process, both of working with our collection committee, working with our council, working with our board, while talking with a number of artists. And intellectual property attorneys as well. So this was the kind of large circle that we were in conversation with, again, for over a year, until we finally got to our first shared stewardship MOU and Memorandum of Understanding, that we were able to purchase a work of art with that MOU from the artist Gabriel Frey, who's a Passamaquoddy artist here in Maine. And then with the support of an intellectual property attorney, this is Jane Anderson, who's a professor at NYU, who does a lot of this work on behalf of Indigenous nations. So it really took a constellation of everyone working together to be able to draft this language. And it was really, I think, a wonderful process of shared growth and learning and knowledge. But one of the extraordinary things that I now think about when I look back at that is that the values in that agreement are so strong, and they really reinforce and challenge so many kind of accepted museum policies, right? So are you going to make it a practice to consult with an artist when you are determining a loan request? Are you going to make it a practice to consult with a specific cultural content expert for conservation, right? So not just an objects conservator, but an objects conservator that has training and experience in this type of work, which is quite different, right, from the way that museums normally think about this work. So it's wonderful to kind of see a document that, again, creates a foundation for an expanded notion of some of these policies. And yet we're also aware that it's only the beginning, right? That this is a part of an ongoing conversation. And so we're also thinking actively about, how does this work continue? What new forms can it take? How widely applicable is this agreement to other commissions or individual purchases that we might be making, right? So I think, as I think we all recognize, and we've already been referencing, this work is incremental. This work is incremental, right? And I think understanding what that means in the institution you're in, what's the change that you're able to make within your space, with the communities that you want to work with, and just kind of inching that needle forward is really the shared work.
Thank you so much. Let me just ask you a question, Shalini. If I'm as a visitor coming to the Portland Museum and I saw one of these works, are there ways in which I would know that the ownership structure was different, or the stewardship structure?
So that's a great question. So right now we do have that work on display, and so that language is in the object text, is in the didactic label text for that work of art. But I think one of the first things that you'll notice when you come to our museum and you look at works by Wabanaki artists is that many of the artists themselves are drafting the label text that accompanies and is juxtaposed with their words. And if it's not them, it is often their apprentices. Like, we are really trying to make it clear that this work is really being, the presentation and the contextualization of this work is really being developed by the cultural knowledge holders, right? And acknowledging that we are not the cultural knowledge holders when it comes to this body of work.
Yeah. So again, that's exactly why I'm so excited by kind of what we're learning from experiences like this, because of course what you described would have been traditionally held as kind of unprofessional, let's say, in the museum space, to let a untrained, outside voice kind of contribute to the interpretation of a work. And I'm using these in air quotes, kind of, because these were concepts, but they were very strongly held. And as we all know, the public doesn't always know, even the didactics and wall text can be highly contested within museums, right? So this is what's so interesting to me, that in some ways you can't responsibly just change the way you own it and steward it without also thinking about how do you explain it to the public, right? And so all of a sudden, these concepts then spill out into other areas. And in fact, and it just also makes you realize in some ways how strange the traditional museum format was. Very rigid. It was like, it was yours, now it's mine, and I can do with it whatever I want, and I can say whatever I want to say about it, right? And now you've undone all of those threads, right? And you have to then figure out how to rebuild what is the structure to make that work, because we are institutions and we're run professionally, and it's just an ongoing balancing act I think it's really quite beautiful to observe. It's complicated, and it's really calling us, I think, to this new level of accountability and engagement. But it leads me now to come back to Susan and ask her about your next step and how your work, because I know the work with the Lisi frescoes did inform concepts of ownership you're now addressing in a whole new way in the blockchain consortium.
I was asked to speak about the frescoes and this and that. And I often found myself in panels or situations, tables, where suddenly it occurred to me that everybody said they wanted to see something different happen, or yes, there are problems with repatriation, but somehow there wasn't really an interest in moving off the mark of what it is that they cared about. So and to interpret that into sort of game language, right, it then became clear to me that we were constantly in a winner-loser story. And, if you couldn't break out of winner-loser, then there was never going to be a more middle ground or more ethical or enlightened solution. And then about 5 years ago or 6 years ago, was told by a friend about blockchain, which is different than NFTs, just for the sake of the record. That blockchain has sort of three principles to it as a technology. It is immutable, which means you can't change the record. It's transparent because in theory, anybody can access it. And it can be a shared ownership. So that was very interesting. I didn't really understand, we're not a coder, and I didn't really exactly understand how it worked, but we put together a group of all women, as it turned out to be, who form this consortium, who have varied skill sets, many of whom came from the technology and legal background. And we realized that you could essentially create a win-win, so to speak, by using blockchain both to establish provenance, but then to agree on a rights kind of splitting in which there would be shared title, shared revenue streams, all of these possibilities that the life of the object incorporated, but had sort of never been in part of a conversation until the idea maybe of this shared ownership could come about.
I love the way that, the technology, the law, the ethical practice is all leading to this very similar direction of kind of undoing very antiquated concepts of zero-sum concepts of ownership. And when you talked about this fact being women only, and Shalini are reacting, we use this word repatriation, but in fact, we have to think what it's referencing is a work of patriation. Right. And it's not an accident, maybe, that that's the word we use. And I know that I've encountered some people who talk about actually the return as an act of rematriation, because you're returning it kind of to a mother country. And so it's kind of interesting in opposition, because of course, this is saying there are always other ways to be thinking about this. And that's what's fascinating to me, that just when you get most dug in to like, it can't be yours because it's mine, is when we find a solution that says maybe the word ours can be defined in a much more expansive way than we've previously imagined, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Shalini, I wonder, because that's what you're saying, like this object that, that you have commissioned or acquired from a living artist is now ours, right? And in a way, it's the public's, it's the artists, it's the museums, in a way that excites me, because that's much more expansive than the idea of museum professionals saying, no, it's ours. So we know what that means. How do you see this kind of inspiring or moving into other aspects of work at the Portland Museum?
I referenced earlier the notion of kind of who drives interpretation of the work that's on your walls, right? Who has a stake in how you're talking about African art? Who has a stake in how you're displaying works from Indonesia, right? And I think that those conversations are now also changing, and they're much more nuanced. And as curators, I think we're all just much more sensitive to the ways in which our words cannot solely reflect our individual perspectives. Right. Mm-hmm. So then the challenge comes for the museum, as you've described, Stephen, the challenge comes for the museum to really channel this new notion of kind of collectivity but yet through individual staff. This is still work. This is still a professional association. We have our codes of conduct and our policies, but yet our work has to really be representative of something much larger than our walls, right? So that museum beyond the walls. So certainly broad notions of interpretation. For the reinstallation of the American art galleries, for example, we used a community advisory group, which many museums are doing, but also adopted a multivocal approach to the interpretive program. So the interpretation in those galleries is from over 50 different contributors, right? So interpretation, I think, is in a big moment of shift and transition in the museum field, as we see with all of the architectural projects, the building projects that are happening with museums really across the country, across the world. How do you create spaces that inspire a different form of community interaction, a different form of collective experience than are, again, traditional gallery spaces in which, artwork is hung, one by one, right after the other on generally white walls designed for a single mode of viewing, right? So spatially, how do we offer a different experience? And I think what was interesting was as we worked with the advisory group through our reinstallation project, that was one of the first comments that came back was, can you spatially do something different here so that it doesn't feel that way?
Remuseum's work is framed a lot around the shift in museum missions, which they have changed from being object-centered to public-centered. And so I think what we're talking about is how do you, and it's a rebalancing. Again, it's not a win or loser. It's not an either or, because objects are our foundation. But how do you balance that with putting the community at the center, the public at the center? And that's why I'm just excited about celebrating examples of museums and leaders who are just trying to figure out what is that complicated, creative, generative middle space, because it gets hard to let go of some of those old ways. It gets hard to get way of thinking of it as winners and losers and feeling a sense of loss rather than a sense of excitement and growth from this. And why I think for me and Remuseum, sharing these stories is so important, that there is this middle way that's more creative, a little scary and exciting.
And that will include more people, right? So I think this is the way that we always talk about it when we're speaking broadly with the public, is that the notion is to really expand out the umbrella, like just make this wider, make more people feel like they're under it, and that they're welcome in it, and that they're actively participating in it, and not certainly ever to exclude anyone.
Yeah.
Right. We talk a lot about the stakeholder table, in the repatriation story, because that has been so sort of frozen for, decades, right? The the Parthenon marbles, forward. So it's pretty interesting when you actually start to base a conversation off of who is at the stakeholder table. It's a whole different conversation immediately, right?
And I can say this as a former lawyer myself. I guess it's a sign that these issues used to be handled by the general counsels,
yes,
the outside attorney, and now they're in the hands of curators, which is a better thing. This lawyer can say. Susan, what do you think? I'm still struck by that comment where you said that Dominique de Menil had a feeling, which is right, that it wasn't just because it was a chapel, but the museum building was not the right place for this. And I think this is kind of what we're talking about, this building that even she had created,
right,
but didn't really have the capacity, if you will, to engage in this new mode. And again, not just how clever and generous that she followed through on that, but what did you learn from that about what either needs to change in the museum building or in the structure, if you will?
I think what I learned is that I'm a big advocate of the life of the object, and you need to let the object talk a little bit more. And I think I learned that idea of listening to it, whatever it might be, in a more maybe open, more real way.
Yeah, I love that concept of, in some ways, we've constrained the capacity of the power of the object itself by putting it in our box, right? We've had this conversation before, and it's exciting for me each time I hear new things in it, and I know that others will enjoy it too. I'm just so grateful for you all sharing this work and doing this work.
I want to come to Portland this summer.
Please do. Please do.
I do.
All are welcome.